helpers start the record. And enough of jaw-jacking from me. I want to introduce Doug Tallamy. He doesn't really need a lot of introduction because you guys probably already know and have had exposure to his work. But Doug's the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture at the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he's authored 118 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 45 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. Doug's books include Bringing Nature Home, The Living Landscape, co-authored with Rick Dark, Nature's Best Hope, Nature of Oaks, and his latest book, How Can I Help? Doug has co-founded the Homegrown National Park movement with Michelle Alfandari, homegrownnationalpark.org. You should check that out. He's also had a lot of awards, and I'm going to stop there because I think Doug speaks for himself. I'm just excited to get him talking, and you guys heard enough from me. So with that, I'm going to stop this share and invite Doug to load up his presentation. And I think I'm going to stop this share.
That's it, yeah.
There we go.
There you go. Thanks for the introduction. I appreciate that. Let's see if I can.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. And just one last reminder to folks, just please keep yourself muted during the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, good. All
Looks
right.
good.
Well, thanks for coming. Thanks for coming, everybody. I am going to talk about Nature's Best Hope. And by now, you know the spoiler, you're Nature's Best Hope. So we're really going to talk about why I think you're Nature's Best Hope. Before we do that, though, let's talk about what Edward O. Wilson's idea of Nature's Best Hope was. Of course, a very famous professor at Harvard, famous entomologist, sociobiologist, conservationist. He did it all for, well, a long time, more than 50 years. And one of the things that was consistent throughout his very long career was his love of life on planet Earth and his efforts to save it. And he wanted to save it not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functional ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it will disappear everywhere. And that includes humans. So a very bold statement, and he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a great idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside, and all those things that are in trouble can be in that half, and we can be in the other half, and it'll be great. Problem is, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture, and I don't see that disappearing anytime soon. And we have 8.3 billion people in the other half, along with all of our roadways and airports and detritus. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we realize E.O. Wilson's dream? That's really what I want to talk about tonight, and I think we can, but we need a new approach to conservation to do that. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about oak mass. Now, in the Pacific Northwest, you really only have one major oak, the Oregon oak, but occasionally they get together and they make their acorns at the same time, and this is what it can look like when that happens. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I take one of those acorns and I just stare at it. And sometimes I'm rewarded. An insect starts to chew its way out of the acorn, chews a little hole for its head, then it forces its head through there, then it forces its body through that hole. It's a tight squeeze. And after it's out of the acorn, it's a dangerous time for that insect because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. That takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly stays in that underground chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, it comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think they have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, they chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in it, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the next year? Well, many species of acorns require 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole, kind of like a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. In this case, she's filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they've left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole and a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move. Grab the larvae, grab the eggs, move the entire colony into the new acorn. That takes about 30 minutes. And after they're inside, they post a guard here, make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? That's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants, that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn, they'll fly up to a mile, maybe a mile and a half from the parent tree. Then they tap it below the surface of the soil. And the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. Specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's basically what they rear their young on, is carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants. And you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this beautiful moth, the beloved Emarginia, unless you have mistletoe, because that's what its larval host plant is. And you won't have mistletoe unless you have those oaks we talked about. There's 100 species of bees in the West, coastal West, including Oregon, that you will not have native bees unless you have the pollen from perennial sunflowers. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We got between 3,500 and 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. So nature is a series of specialized relationships, and my point here is that actually most of these relationships today are in trouble. Nature itself is on the ropes, and it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave most of the country as it was, particularly the lower 48 states. It's only about 5% that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition, and those are typically mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly, we have tilled it, we have drained it, we have grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland out there. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. You can spell that any way you want. We've polluted our skies, changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need. Because again, it is nature that sustains us on this planet. Edwin Wade Teal, decades ago, said we cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves. It's just common sense. Yet that's what we have been doing. We continue to do that. And you might wonder why. And I don't know why. But I suspect we have thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we're wrong about that. And we're starting to see headlines in a regular clip that are reminding us that we have a problem. Like this one, the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. It's a third of our North American bird population, already gone. The UN's predicting we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years. And they made that prediction 4 years ago. So I guess it's the next 16 years now. The good news is it's a prediction. It has not happened yet, and we have to make sure it does not happen. Because again, these are the species that are keeping us alive on this planet. It is serious business. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and as Shakespeare would say, upon all of our houses. That's not what this talks about. This talks about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me. Those efforts to deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline, the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what would happen if insects were to disappear from Earth, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. Excuse me. And if insects disappeared, life as we know it would change drastically. Life as we know it depends on insects. most of our flowering plants would go extinct. And if that happens, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our vertebrate animals would collapse. We'd lose our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients. Now we would have is bacteria and fungi. And again, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. Excuse me, a little tickle in my throat. There is good news, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself. But we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. Why is that? Remember, humans are part of nature. We're totally dependent. We're products of healthy ecosystems. We depend on the life support that those ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. These are just a few things that plants do that we depend on every day, like oxygen, pretty important, clean water. Plants are cleaning our water, slowing its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants are pulling, they're building their tissues out of the carbon they pull out of carbon dioxide, pull it out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way. And they fix more carbon through photosynthesis than they use. And they pump the extra carbon through their root systems into the ground. And once it's in the ground, it's very stable. Plants are building topsoil, they're holding it in place, they're preventing floods, they're dampening severe weather, they're converting sunlight into food. And if we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight, and then we will lose weight. What are animals doing for plants? They're providing pest control services. They're pollinating nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They're dispersing plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of the 8.3 billion people on the planet demanding more and more ecosystem services every day. Now, we do have parks, we do have preserves, and they're doing the best they can, but we're inching our way towards the sixth great extinction event the planet has ever experienced, which means it's not good enough. So I think what we have to do is start to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like this. And there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups, of course, that have been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another place, doing the same thing. Not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we were capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called a land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac, his most famous book. What he did not write about, though, was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that we can't live with nature. Humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still remains in our own culture, that he might not have recognized it as an option. Tonight, my message, though, is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And that means we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every day, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, private property. Most of the country is privately owned. 78% of the entire lower 48 states privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail, and failure is not an option. When I use the words conservation, I'm not using it exactly the way I mean. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left out there. That's been our conservation model for the last century. We want to keep doing that. But again, it hasn't been good enough. So we have to go beyond conservation into restoration. We have to rebuild nature in as many places as we possibly can. You may be thinking, well, there's no way you're going to put it back together again exactly the way it was. And you're probably right. We've changed too many things, but we can reunite enough of those specialized relationships I opened the talk with to create ecosystem function again, even if it's not exactly what was in a particular space at some point in the past. But we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally, so we have to start with the most important group. And there's two groups we can't do without. One is the flowering plants, and of course the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They are capturing energy from the sun, turning it into simple sugars and carbohydrates through photosynthesis, which is the food that supports just about all the life on planet Earth. So now we have the food that animals need locked up in plant tissues. If you don't get that food to animals, you don't have any animals. If you don't have animals, you don't have a functional ecosystem. Well, it turns out that most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that eat those plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, and not just any insect. Turns out that caterpillars are enormously important in terms of transferring energy from plants to other animals. That's why Dan Jansen, very famous ecologist, calls them the meat and potatoes of terrestrial food webs. If we build landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the chickadee that lives in my yard in southeast Pennsylvania. You, of course, have the black-capped chickadee here and the mountain chickadee and the chestnut-backed chickadee. They're all pretty much the same bird doing the same thing. One of the things they do during the winter is go to our feeders and eat seeds. So we tend to think that's all chickadees need. But even in the wintertime, only 50% of their diet is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. And when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. And that is true for most of the birds out there. Baby birds cannot eat seeds. So they switch to invertebrates. And if they are in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not alone. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? It's actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because they're soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Beaks like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and many beetles have really sharp edges too. Then finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate and birds are vertebrates and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? Again, during the breeding season, from all those things they're bringing back to the nest. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among bird prey. The first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars. Here are the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. There's also a direct relationship between how often a prey item is brought back to the nest and its carotenoid content. Caterpillars are brought back more often than anything else, and they have the highest carotenoid content, followed by orthopterids, crickets, grasshoppers, katydids, and then all these other things that brought back once in a while have very low carotenoid content. So those studies and others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of most bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough, or one or two a day enough? It's a good question. So let's go back to Carolina chickadee. There's a lot of data on Carolina chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of Carolina chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands. Depending on the number of chicks in the nest, it can be as many as 9,000 caterpillars. But let's generalize and say at least 5,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So it's a lot of caterpillars required to make a bird that's a third of an ounce. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard because they only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way where there are not all those caterpillars in our yards, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group who said we've lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into two groups, the species that require insects, particularly when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects. So things like doves and finches and crossbills can actually make a little milk out of the seeds that they eat, and they can rear their young on that. And look, that group didn't lose any, where's my arrow? Didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years. But the birds that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. So I think we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing, and that's be pretty. Now we have to ask them to do two things, be pretty and ecologically functional at the same time, and that's not going to happen unless we put those caterpillars back. So how do you add caterpillars to landscapes? Well, you add the plants that support those caterpillars. Seems pretty straightforward, but there is a catch, and that is most plants don't support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we add to our landscapes, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the ginkgos and all the hostas and all the privet and all the burning bush, all the things we typically landscape with from Asia in our yards, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization, and it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. Why is that? Because plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And if you don't believe me, after this talk, go out and eat a plant. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. It's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there, particularly in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They're too well protected. But insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? This is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat plants for which they have very specialized adaptations that allow them to circumvent those chemical defenses. Specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of interacting with those plants for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. So if you remove the milkweeds from your yard, the monarch's not going to start to eat your hostas. It's locked into eating milkweeds, and it has two options: fly away and find milkweeds someplace else, or starve to death. Three kinds of plants out there: plants that actually contribute energy to the local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to the local food webs, and plants that remove energy from the local food webs. The very best contributor in 84% of the counties in which they occur is one of our oaks. Now, up here in the Pacific Northwest, you're oak limited. You've got the Gary oak, and I believe in Southern Oregon, you got black oak too. But there are 91 species of oaks in this country, and they're contributing more energy to local ecosystems than any other plant genus. Ginkgo is a good example of plants that do not contribute energy. Ginkgo biloba from Asia, it's a nice ornamental plant, it has good fall color, but nothing eats a ginkgo. So it's not adding any energy to the local food web. And a good example of a detractor would be any of our invasive ornamentals that are not contributing energy, but they're also escaping and competing with removing the native plants that do contribute energy. So there's a net loss of energy from our local food webs. All I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. We cannot restore ecosystems if we don't restore the food webs within those ecosystems, and that's not going to happen unless we choose the right plants. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of what happens when we do choose the right plants, starting with what's happened at our house where my wife Cindy and I live. This is what it looked like in the year 2000 when we moved into our new home. It was a very old farm, been farmed almost 300 years. It was broken up into 10-acre lots. We got one of those lots. And it had been mowed for hay before we moved in. So they're very, not much there. And our goal was to restore the ecosystem, deciduous forest ecosystem that had been gone for about 300 years. And of course, we'd never done this before, so we didn't know what we were doing. But one of the things I wanted to do was to put the host plant of a particular species of caterpillar in our yard and see whether it got colonized, see whether we could actually restore that relationship. And the first one I started with was the Canadian owlet. I'd never seen a Canadian owlet before. It's a pretty little thing. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have their host plant, meadow host plant specialization. And we didn't have any meadow. I'm sure it was there 300 years ago before it got farmed to death, but the meadow was long gone. So I got some meadow seeds from someplace and I planted them and it grew very nicely. But this was early on and I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would be able to find my meadow. So I didn't even go out and check it for 2 or 3 months after I planted it. Then I was walking by for another reason and I glanced over. It was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. So now we have a good population of Canadian owlets and a good population of meadow. We've added 2 species to the property. So the restoration has begun. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's actually a misnomer. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have any Biden's aristosa, but I did know where there were some Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, last year they took over the front yard. That's okay. I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of Bidens, but they did, and now we have a good population of both of these organisms. So we've added 4 species to the property. Want to see if the hackberry emperor could make a living at our house, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that ought to be on our space. Excuse me. Well, as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on celtis. We didn't have any hackberry. So I planted a couple hackberry trees. I had to wait 4 years for the hackberry emperor to find my hackberry, but they did. Now we've got a good population of them. We've added 6 species, and that's how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that specialize on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. There are 110 species of moths that use goldenrod in the mid-Atlantic states. Very important plant. I planted Virginia creeper. Now, if you're from the East, you might go, ooh, people don't like Virginia creeper, but I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's a good ground cover. It makes valuable berries for the birds. And by valuable, I mean those berries are high in fat. So in the fall, migrating birds depend on berries from Virginia creeper, and overwintering birds depend on those berries. They're a good source of energy. And those berries come from inconspicuous little flowers. You don't even know when Virginia creeper's in bloom until you see this big cloud of native bees around it. Turns out that Virginia creeper is a wonderful pollinator plant. So remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for supporting the big sphinx moths that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful doe, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the double-toothed prominent to make a living at our house, just because it's such a cool-looking caterpillar. It looks like a stegosaurus. Well, it's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm. Of course, we didn't have any American elm. It lost it to the Dutch elm disease decades ago. But there are 2 big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die. And every year they make a lot of seed. So the second year after we moved in, I gathered up some of the seed from the gutter and planted them at home, and they germinate in 6 days, grow very quickly. Today, those trees are over 80 feet tall. And yes, they brought in the double-toothed prominent American elm. Want to see if the evening primrose could make a living at our house because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. And as its name suggests, it's a specialist on evening primrose. And we didn't have any evening primrose. So I got some evening primrose and it worked. The moth came, spend the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded, but it's always very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plant lineages that we have put back in our yard. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak at when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to local food webs, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted my oaks as acorns, free, or 2-foot bare root webs, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to call in the moths that create the caterpillars that run the food web at our house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the medium dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of caterpillars have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. And people say, oh no, he's going to kill the tree. No, an ovenbird's going to come eat it in the next 20 minutes. So this tiny little tree in its first month of life is contributing to the local food web. You do not have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oaks to be productive. They will be productive right away. So the question is, has life returned? Now this is, took this picture from pretty much the same place I took the first picture. Give you an idea, we put some of the plants back, still working on it. And you can measure whether you're succeeding or not any way you want. I'm measuring life in terms of the number of species of birds that have bred on our property and the number of caterpillar species, the moth caterpillar species that I have been able to find and photograph. Last week, this beautiful creature, the Luna moth, came to my yard, and it's the third one I've seen this year. And it's not an accident. It is here because I planted its host plant, sweet gum. So we have a population of Luna moths because I put what they needed in our yard. And you can do the same thing. And I have been counting the moths on our property for, I don't know, 8-9 years now. And I'm up to 1,377 species of moths so far, including that Luna moth. And it's still going. I'd probably get another one tonight if I were home counting them again. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we have recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline we see all the time. World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. It's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I'm convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We really could turn these statistics around. But can it work on smaller properties in suburbia? Excellent question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development. Everybody around them has the big lawns. When they moved in, their yard was choked with Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, another serious invasive from Asia. So the first thing they did was get rid of that. Then they planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature that they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds using their yard. And they're up to 154 bird species they've recorded in their yard, including an amazing 35 warbler species. Just to compare that to our property, we've only recorded 18 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, her property abuts O'Hare Airport. There's a little tower over there. She has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's not connected to any natural area at all. So she's a little island in the middle of Chicago. It's a pretty island because Pam is a native plant landscaper and she knows what she's doing. But she did the same thing. She removed her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, included a water feature. And then she sat back, she says, with a glass of wine, and started to count the birds using her property. And she's up to 127 species of birds that have used her 1/10 of an acre, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. All right, there's 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way, and we need to succeed in a big way. And one of those things is we've got to reduce the area that we have in lawn. Now, the Pacific Northwest is not the major problem here with lawn, but across the country, we've got 44 million acres of lawn, which is an area bigger than the size of New England, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Why do we do that? Well, couple of reasons. It's a status symbol, a very important status symbol. We all pretend we're wealthy by having big, immaculate lawns. We like neat, and it's easy to keep a lawn neat, and we have to display our Halloween decorations. But remember, there are 4 very important ecological responsibilities that every single landscape out there has. Every landscape has to support a viable food web. Every landscape has to sequester carbon to help climate change. Every landscape has to manage the watershed in which it lies, and every landscape has to support pollinators. Lawn does none of those things, which is why I pick on it. So what if we reduce the area of lawn? Let's cut the area of lawn in half. Let's take places like this and turn them into this. I got this picture from Dan Getman in Missouri. Had this big lawn and he started to replant it, so he sent me this picture. Well, let's make the math simple. Let's say we got 40 million acres of lawn. We're going to cut that in half. That'll give us 20 million acres we can restore right at home, which is the area we're going to build Homegrown National Park out of. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. It's a real thing now, a small nonprofit. You go to our website and register your property on the biodiversity map. So what you're doing is you're putting down your location and then the amount of your area, your property, that you're going to be a good steward of, or you already are being a good steward of. Maybe you're going to reduce the area that's in lawn. You record that. Maybe you're going to plant a Gary oak. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. It doesn't matter how modest your contribution is. All that data will go into our data bank, and then your little piece of your county is going to light up with a firefly. That's our emblem. Canada's playing this game now. And of course, our goal is to get the entire country to light up with fireflies. Our vision is very simple. We are envisioning a world where conservation landscaping is mainstream. It's the default behavior of everyone and every organization out there. So if you actually do this, you will not be the kook down the street. You will be mainstream. There are real ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and a significant increase in biodiversity right where we live, where we work, where we play is one of them. And what's happened at our house, my wife lives there too, tells me this is, it will work. Nature's extremely resilient if we give her half a chance. Measurable reduction in invasive species. If everybody removed the invasive plants just from their property, we'd be 78% done nationwide. We'd be 85% done in the East. Not completely done, but a very good first step. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Lawn is the worst plant for sequestering carbon. So any other type of planting is going to sequester more carbon than lawn. You're going to help climate change. We're also going to start to build viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. Any bit of conservation we do outside of a park is going to help conservation inside of the park. But there are equally important sociological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and national awareness is one of them, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are and what our roles in those solutions are. We are trying to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's not just there for our entertainment. It's essential. It's essential for everybody on the planet. So I think everybody owns responsibility for sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action is even better. And we want to merge all of the existing conservation organizations that are out there. Sierra Club, National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones, all the land conservancies. We want to get the good conservation they are doing on private property onto the biodiversity map in Homegrown National Park. You know, we've got the 30 by 30 initiative, which is step one to the 50 by 50 initiative, and that is to save 30% of the earth, 30% of the US by 2030. There is no way that's going to happen if we don't count the conservation that's happening on private property. Did I mention the Homegrown National Park is free? We're not trying to pull organizations away or pull membership away from other organizations. We're not competing with them. We're all on the same page. We just want to record the good conservation that people are doing out there. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants should we put in the area that was once lawn? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I call keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is? It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch, and if you take it out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of that caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that are holding that house up. They're the support system. You cannot build a house without support. We've been trying to build houses with wallpaper in the last 100 years, and that just doesn't work. Again, oaks are the best keystone plant across the country. 270 species of caterpillars supported by oaks in California, 557 species in the mid-Atlantic states, over 1,000 species nationwide. No other plant genus comes close to that. If you want to know what the best plants are where you live, you go to Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the most important woody and herbaceous plants in your county will pop up. Now, here in the Pacific Northwest, oaks are not the most important plant. There's only one or two species. Willows take over, followed by prunus. Cottonwood's really important. Alders become important. And then oaks are down here. But these are all really important plants in terms of supporting the caterpillars that drive our food web. And here are the top herbaceous plants. And the list is much longer than this when you go to the website. So the old excuse of not knowing what to plant is just an excuse now. Go to Native Plant Finder and you do know what to plant. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which is not the goal. Turns out that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines, not just in this country and Europe, but around the world. And these are all the ways that lights are killing our nocturnal insects. It is a really serious environmental problem. Of course, we've got a lot of lights out there. Really serious environmental problem, but it has a really simple solution. And that is take those white lights and turn them into yellow lights. Yellow lights do not attract nocturnal insects. You could also put a motion sensor on your lights. You can actually turn your light off. You're allowed to do that. But if you're worried about security, put a motion sensor on the light so it only turns on when the bad man comes. But again, yellow bulbs. Replace your white bulbs with yellow bulbs. You can buy them at the hardware store because yellow amber lights do not attract nocturnal insects. If we were to switch out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we could save millions of dollars. And if we use LEDs, we could save, no, if we take the bulbs out, we could save millions of insects. And if we use LEDs, we could save millions of dollars. All right, another thing we have to do is think about how we landscape underneath those trees we're adding to our property in a way that will allow those caterpillars to complete their development. So I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches, then it emerges as an adult, then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree, and I wish all the species did that, but most of them don't. 94% of them will finish growing as caterpillars on the tree, and then they drop from the tree and wiggle their way underneath the ground and pupate underground. Or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. It's messy. And we mow and compact the area under our tree so that it's rock hard, really hard for those caterpillars to get underground to safety. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. Now, this is what most people do. You've got a tree in your yard and it's surrounded by grass. I just finished up a master's student, Emma Jonas, who measured how well caterpillars do in a situation like this versus a situation like this, a layered landscape. This is what Heather Holm calls soft landing. Caterpillars fall down, and it's not really about keeping them from getting hurt when they fall down. It's about creating an area where we don't walk, where we don't mow, so that the ground is not compacted, so the caterpillars can get underground, they can find leaf litter, no problem at all, much higher survivorship. You can do that not just in the east, but in the west. You're creating no-go zones where we're not going to mow and disturb the area underneath our trees. There's also room for compromise in our plant choices. This comes from Desiree Narango, one of my former PhD students. She did a 5-year study with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., looking at how well their populations were sustained in landscapes with varying degrees of native plants. And it turns out that if you have 70% of your woody plant biomass native, chickadees can sustain their populations. And that gives you 30% that you can compromise with. Now, we can't tolerate any invasive species. Invasive species are ecological tumors and they just keep growing. But there's a lot of ornamental plants that are not invasive, even though they're not native. Remember Dan Getman? This is a ginkgo tree. Why does Dan have a ginkgo tree in his native plant landscape? Well, it turns out that Dan's wife likes ginkgo trees, and Dan likes his wife, so he planted a ginkgo tree. The question is this tree going to destroy the productivity of this landscape? No, it's just there. It's just taking up a little space. Is it going to escape and wreck the woodlot? No, they're not invasive. So I like to think of ornamental trees like this that are not contributing very much other than aesthetics as statues. So there you go. There's Dan's statue. If all of Dan's plants were statues, he would not have a functional landscape. Now, here is a caveat. I got an email the other day from an urban forester who said, look, there really are benefits from non-native trees in cities in particular. They're lowering the heat island. They are helping to manage the watershed. They're just not very productive in supporting the food web. So when I say they are like statues, I mean in terms of the food web. Point is, it's not the presence of non-native plants that is destroying food webs. It's the absence of those native plants. If we increase the percentage of those important contributing native plants, we can tolerate a number of these. Can native plants be used in formal landscapes? Of course they can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. You don't get more formal than that. This was taken by a drone 400 feet up. Every plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in that design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. They love them over there. If fancy Parisians can love our native plants, maybe we can too. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells your neighbor it's not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's meeting the needs of several species of bees. It's not very big. It could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Help what? Help make pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? Well, the media will say because they pollinate a third of our crops. Very anthropocentric view of why we need pollinators. It's also not correct. They pollinate about a 1/12 of our crops. And I hear people say, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. You get good options here on the West Coast, California lilac. Not only is it beautiful, not only does it support a lot of caterpillars, but it's also a wonderful pollinator plant. Same with your native asters. So you can play this game too. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota's been doing it for a number of years now. They've got a cost-sharing program that is encouraging homeowners to reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very, very popular. Pennsylvania has a similar program. Virginia's thinking about it. So this idea is starting to spread. Great story in Marco Island off of Florida. This is the subspecies of burrowing owl in Florida, and it's a listed species. Well, if you live on Marco Island, this little guy has now become a status symbol. There he is sitting on his little post there next to a burrow. As a matter of fact, if you allow a burrowing owl to burrow in the front yard, they pay you $250. There's now 400 breeding pairs of burrowing owls on Marco Island because we decided we could live with them. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. We're going to pay you to take care of an endangered species rather than fine you if you use your property. Put a bounty on invasive plants like calorie pear. There's a whole bunch of them. And that's what St. Louis, Missouri did, Fayetteville, Arkansas, North Carolina. If you take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. In water-stressed areas, and that's more and more these days, some public utilities are giving people $100 coupons to plant water-efficient native plants instead of the thirsty non-natives. And of course, the big lawn reduction programs in Southern California. This is going up. You get between $3 and $5 rebate per square foot of lawn that you remove and replace with xeric plantings in Southern California. I think we've made 3 missteps in our early years of conservation, and this one's really important. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. We like nature. We like to go bird watching or just walk and absorb its many wonders, but we don't think it's essential. And if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, nature takes a back seat. Went to the Cincinnati Zoo, actually before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which epitomizes to me our society's view of conservation. We want to save wildlife, we want to save nature so that future generations can enjoy it. It was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for expanding the national park system. Beautiful places. We want to save them so that future generations can enjoy it. And I get that because nature is enormously entertaining, but it is much more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It is that serious. We've also seen that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about this, but if we restrict conservation just to the places where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those places are now too small, there's too few of them, and they're too isolated. David Quammen has a wonderful analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I don't like that language because it suggests there's places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks. We've got to put the plants back, not just to make biological corridors that connect viable habitat with each other, but to create viable habitat, recreate viable habitat in all those places where we've destroyed it. And the good news is it is starting to happen. We can make it happen faster, but it's starting to happen. And when it does, it'll be the first time in modern history that humans have coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep is to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every person on the planet, but I don't know why, since every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of local ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody be responsible for taking care of those ecosystems? That does not mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. More and more people are worried about the state of the planet, but they feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can put in keystone plants, one person can remove their invasive species, one person can put in a pollinator garden. There's a whole bunch of things that one person can do to revitalize the ecosystem services on their property and then enhance their greater local ecosystem instead of continuing to detract it. And it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you're going to start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They'll love you as a volunteer. Ada Leopold said, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. He said that in the 40s, and he was alone in a world of wounds. But no longer, you are no longer alone. Everywhere, people are starting to heal the wounds on their little piece of the earth, and you can as well. Robert Swan recently said the greatest threat to our planet is believing that someone else will save it. It's not going to be someone else, folks. It's going to be you, folks, because you are nature's best hope. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Doug. That is just so inspiring. I mean, I feel like we're drinking from a fire hose here of concepts, but there's just so um,
Oh, don't drown.
implement.
Don't drown.
It's nice to know there's something we can do that we can implement right here.
That's right. There are lots of things.
I'm looking here in the chat. I have a comment from Jennifer just saying, "Oh, I love those hairy caterpillars," and I have to agree. The caterpillars are just fantastic. We don't spend enough time looking at how unique and interesting they are. Thanks for sharing so many examples there. That was really cool. I have a question for you, and that's about, what can you do if you don't have land? I mean, you kind of mentioned at the end there, contribute to other stuff, but with so many people not having the privilege to own land at this point, they're renters. Like I noticed you had a picture there of that small, perhaps even potted pollinator garden. Anything else you want to add and suggest for folks who don't own the land but might like to do something to contribute there?
Right. Well, other than volunteering on land that does exist, container gardening is always the way I answer that. So most people in an apartment do have a balcony, or if you have a tiny little plot, you have a little front porch. You can use native plants in containers. Picture an apartment complex with no plants on the balconies. It's just a pile of bricks. If everybody had their balcony well planted in container plants, it then becomes a valuable resource to urban bees. And there are a lot of species of urban bees that are trying to make a living out there. The migrating monarch will stop at those plants. So there are things you can do. And it's important because, as you say, more and more people live in our urban areas, about 82% of us. So that's important. I'll also add, probably the most important thing you can do is vote. Whether you live in an apartment complex or not, vote for administrations that are environmentally conscious, and that will make a huge difference.
Thank you for that. Getting a lot of just great feedback here about how much folks love your presentation and have shared your work. Got a thank you from Kaylee, says, thank you for being such an inspiration. Also work in OSU Extension, and I talk about you and your message and my gardening and for walking, talking. I'm trying to do my part by teaching people about being the change and on my balcony,
Okay,
planted
that's
currently
good.
in a wildfire mix. So it sounds like she's
Very
already
good.
on that.
Very good.
I guess I have another question for you since I see a lot of comments, but I haven't seen a question come in here yet. So something that occurred to me was, if we do a good job of bringing back native plants like you're describing, and we get them back onto a big chunk of that landscape through our yards, what about the wild cards of climate change and maybe even pesticides? I mean, I grew up on a landscape that was, fairly unaltered, oak woodlands and stuff, but I noticed insects disappearing over time, even though we weren't changing our management. So just curious
Yeah.
what your thoughts are there.
Yeah. That's a big question. Well, of course, people are talking about assisted migration to deal with climate change. Let's take southern plants and plant them up north, and that will help. I'm not a fan of that because climate change is not just a gradual warming, it's increased climate variability. And the jet stream these days is wild swings. And when it goes far north, it's warmer up there than it should. But when it goes far south, it's colder than it should be. It snowed in Florida this winter twice. It snowed in Baton Rouge, Louisiana last winter. 9 inches of snow got down to 9 degrees. And these polar vortices are happening every single winter now. So you'd have to deal with that in moving plants up north. And if we move them farther away from the plants and animals they co-evolve with, It's just like introducing a plant from another continent. They're not going to be associated with those insects that help them pass on their energy.
Mhm.
It's not just about having plants live, it's about having them be productive. So I'd rather depend on the genetic variability that is already in our plant systems and hope that it's enough to compensate for the crazy swings we're throwing at them. Of course, the real solution is to stop fooling around with climate change and get serious about addressing it so that we don't just assume, well, it's going to, it is happening and it's going to continue to happen, but it doesn't have to be as bad as we're making it. So that's one thing. The pesticides, we use neonicotinoid seed coatings in our corn, our soybeans, and our wheat, and they do not increase yield at all. So it's a preventive. Oh, what if something happens? We do it because it's cheap and because the seed companies tell us to do it. But only 5% of that material is taken up by the plant. The other 95% washes off or blows away. And we have no idea. We know that when it gets into water systems, it's very persistent and it's killing things. We don't know what that dust is doing. I got an email from a lady in Montana who said, I don't have grasshoppers anymore, and there's no agriculture around me, and I'm convinced it's neonicotinoids blowing in from Idaho. And I can't tell her she's wrong. I mean, nobody's studied this, but yeah, things are disappearing. Why? Who knows? So unnecessary use of pesticides is another. That's just a no-brainer. They're already banned in Europe. I mean, so we can do that too.
Yeah.
And
So
one other
reduce.
thing, I know you don't do it much here, but mosquito fogging. It is a booming business around the country. It doesn't control mosquitoes. It'll knock them down for a week or so, but it does kill everything else. I'm just finishing a paper right now. We looked at the impact of barrier sprays up to 30 days after the spray was applied, and everything that walks across those surfaces dies. Monarchs, pollinators, all the charismatic insects, all the natural enemies, all non-targets are killed by this stuff. So no more mosquito farm. We control mosquitoes in the larval stage, not the adult stage.
Here we tend to use products in water sources a lot, and it's always kind of questionable what that might be doing too. Hopefully it's targeting just the mosquito, but I guess our conversation there prompted some folks. We got a bunch more stuff, but I do want to read this comment from Christina Lefebvre, who founded Pollinator Project Rogue Valley. Just wanted to comment, I'm sure you've heard many times that you are one of my inspirations back in 2007, and now I get to work with a fabulous team of Pollinator Project Rogue Valley folks and so many community members who are doing one thing and many things to make the planet a better one for pollinators and people. So I think there's a great testament to the inspiration you're providing here. Thank you for that.
Well, I thank her for that very much.
It's good work that she's doing and others. A question. I have a yard that's part of the Homegrown National Park and a certified backyard habitat. Along with the wonderful creatures that have come to live our own patch of land, we've had some non-native bees that have also moved in as well. This is the first year I found wool carder bees, which are so aggressive in defending their space. Should I try and capture and cull or just leave it be?
Good question. When I say we need insects, I'm not talking about non-native ones that are here without their natural enemies. And that unfortunately includes honeybees, which compete seriously with our native bees. We all love our honeybees, but they knock native bee populations down about 80%. That's what the research is showing. So yeah, I'll leave that up to you, but our ecosystems function best when they are comprised of organisms that co-evolve together. The bees we brought in, the diseases we brought in, they just cause huge problems. Emerald ash borer, look what it's done to our ashes, all the oak diseases that are out there. So yeah, if you have the opportunity of actually catching one and trying to control it, that I wouldn't be mad.
Paul Sheldon just mentions that that Pollinator Project Rogue Valley probably has a good list of host native plants and for moths in our area. I would encourage folks to check it out because I'm sure they do have resources there. Gary asks, "What's the best app for IDing caterpillars? What do you like to use for IDing caterpillars?" You're an entomologist, so you probably.
Yeah. Uh, there aren't any great apps. You can take a picture of it, send it to iNaturalist, and you'll probably do pretty well there. Microleps are tough. I rely on Dave Wagner, who has written Caterpillars of the Eastern North America, and he's been working on Caterpillars of the Western North America for the last 15 years. It'll be out one of these years. Um, but you can take a picture of it, and some of these apps will get you close, but you don't know whether they're right or not. So I think iNaturalist is where you're actually letting an expert look at it, or Bug Guide would be two good sources for getting IDs.
Sarah asks, do you have advice for a fire controlled ecosystem like ours?
Yeah. Um, I know that's tough. I live in the East where we just don't worry about fire very much. I would look at the California Native Plant Societies, the way they have addressed it. They've actually got plans of where you can put your plants in relation to the house. In the East, we talk about leaving the leaf litter. It's so important in terms of returning nutrients to the soil and maintaining the soil productivity. But of course, that's really discouraged in the West. And I can tell you that live oaks, which you don't have, but as you go down to California, they do. They're actually very good at catching these flying embers when you get crown fires and putting them out. So a rim of live oaks around your house is not something that's going to encourage fires. The real problem here, if you look at pictures of the Paradise Fire, all the houses burned down completely. Many of the trees are standing right there, almost untouched. And it's because we build our houses out of really flammable material. So if we reverse that, and if you have a house, you're not going to knock it down and rebuild it, but we common sense. We're building right in a fire climax community, and we use flammable materials. So we have problems, and removing all the vegetation so you don't have a fire is that's just not gonna. It's not sustainable. Let's just put it that way. So,
Yeah, and you had mentioned, how high value oaks are on the landscape, and luckily they tend to be one of our more fire resilient species. So
yes, yes.
helping to promote oak landscapes is good.
Yeah, actually, the oak savannas everywhere depended on fire, and without it, particularly in the upper Midwest, they're getting all choked out because we've prevented fires for the last 100 years. So we've lost that savanna situation, and oak regeneration is very poor in those situations. They require fire.
Kaylee asks, do you have any other books that you would recommend reading on this topic outside of the things that you've written?
Larry Weiner has a book on, it's more of a how-to book about landscaping. It's really based on Eastern ecoregions, so not sure how helpful that would be in the West. This living in the East really makes it hard to answer questions like that. If I think of something, I will send it to you. Actually, we saw a book today in the library, Native Plants of the Pacific Northwest. That should be helpful. Didn't catch the author, but it does exist. Two authors. So
Okay. Lindy also says, I live in a very rural community or very rural wildfire prone area. Curious about balancing this type of landscaping with nearly constant wildfires. I guess we're coming back to that question. Um, I guess native plants may be more wildfire resistant and I think we sort of know that.
You
If
know,
you
if
were
you're
working,
in a if you're in a fire climax community, that means it historically burnt periodically, reducing the amount of fuel on the forest floor so that you didn't have crown fires. You had forest floor fires that kept things more open. I know the Native Americans managed with fire to increase acorn production. They ate acorns, a lot of acorns. It was a really valuable source of food, so they managed for that. It's we get these crown fires when we don't do any fire management for 100 years, and then there's a tremendous amount of fuel, so everything goes crazy. And of course, the droughts on top of it are not helping. This is where climate change is really clobbering us in the Southwest is terrible, terrible droughts. So the problems we have are largely problems we've created ourselves.
I just love how native plants are so good at solving a lot of those problems, though. And, having evolved on this landscape with fire, if you're working with native plants, you're setting things up to be able to handle fire and fire
Sure.
transition because that's what these plants evolved with. And so it's
I mean, look at all the conifers that have serotinous cones. They won't germinate unless they go through the heat of a forest fire. So, fire dependent species.
have you ever used any fire as a tool for sort of reestablishing native plants, like burning piles or burning any material on your own
No,
land?
I would love to use fire at home, but my neighbor, who also had 10 acres, moved in before me. He was burning trash and he almost burnt down the neighborhood. And the attitude towards it is very, very poor at this point.
Mhm.
We just don't do fire in the East the way they particularly do in the Midwest. There's a guy, Jack Pizzo, who's got a company, and he doesn't know why we don't burn in the West. He says he can start and stop a fire on a dime, and it's a very valuable management tool. And I would love to use it at my house. We've got Japanese stilt grass, which is a serious invasive, an annual, and I could control it with fire, but I can't.
Mhm. Well,
I
come out
don't.
west, you can play with some
I
fire.
don't. We also have we've got a big dip in the property, and fire engines would not be able to get to half of the property. So it's a real constraint. So
Mm, okay. Elisa says, unfortunately, I joined late, so maybe you talked about this, but I don't think we did. She just asked, what can you do to encourage folks who have been using herbicides for years to transition away from them?
yeah, that's a tough question because herbicides are a valuable tool in our invasive species control programs. They're easily overused. The reason monarchs have declined, particularly in the east, is that Roundup Ready corn and soybeans, the grower now sprays right to the root and kills all the native plants, all the goldenrod and milkweed and asters, all the things the monarchs need, and planted it with grass. So it's a total misuse of this product. Um, but properly used, it can be a powerful tool. So I guess I would encourage, rather than saying, if you use it, the whole world's going to die, I would say use it properly. There's a marsh in Ohio called Mentor Marsh. It was the largest Phragmites stand, which is the common reed from Europe. 811 acres of Phragmites, and Phragmites is historically really hard to get rid of. Well,
Mhm.
they got serious about it and they used herbicide and they did control it. And now it's a vibrant freshwater marsh. There are listed freshwater species there. And none of that would have happened without controlling that. So um, I'm glad they did, and it proves that the area is not poison or toxic afterwards when it's used properly. So it's all about proper use.
Thanks for that. Bonnie asks, what are your thoughts on mistletoe and oaks? Is the ecological food web benefit greater than the risk to the oak's health?
That would be my knee-jerk reaction. Does that mean that there's ever a time where there's too many mistletoe on a particular oaks? No, but generally speaking, they're in balance, and it's a feature of a healthy oak savanna is having these mistletoes. So again, the idea that I have to get rid of every mistletoe or the oak's going to die. No, I don't buy that. I don't think that's the case. They were working it out for many thousands of years before we got here. So if it's out of balance, what are we doing to force it out of balance? I don't know enough about the mistletoe oak system in the West to say anything meaningful. I know in the East, it's just not a big deal in the East. They're there, but it's not a big deal.
I was interested to learn recently about how much deer love to eat mistletoe. And
Oh,
when
really?
people bring it down, drop it to the ground, it just gets savaged.
Well, of course, deer love everything, but
Yeah, especially on a dry landscape.
yeah,
Um, is there a resource for which plants host which caterpillars, like where you could make the association between things you plant and what caterpillars you might get?
that's that native plant finder I talked about. Not only does it tell you the number of species it supports, but you can go backwards. You can say, "Here's the tiger swallowtail. What does it eat in my county?" And it will tell you that. And of course, this big work that Dave Wagner's working on, it will have all that information. He's added lots of new host records. He just has to publish it. So
Um,
there
Jennifer
is,
also,
but I'll say one more thing. There's a new book on moths of Western US by Seabrook Leckey, and she has host plant information in there as well. So it's the pictures of the adult moths, but she has host plant records for the caterpillars. It's not terribly complete, but it's much better than nothing.
Well, folks who are still on the call, I'd encourage you to look in the chat. There's a lot of good conversation going on there and back and forth between people who are very knowledgeable in our region and sharing resources. So I'll leave that up for a little bit. Last question with the couple minutes we have left. You know, I feel like I remember in Nature's Best Hope, you mentioned mowing a little bit and some of the benefits of mowing high. Mowing's a major thing for us in this region, and a lot of us are actually compelled to mow our properties by, county and municipal codes. And so we think of it as like, okay, I've got to mow. Well, you know, I remember you talking a little bit about stubble height and how that might support some of the uh, native pollinators or native bees in particular, perhaps. Anyway, can you say a little bit about mowing, both in time and sort of height, and how we might use that to? We have to do it, but maybe there's a way we can do it with a little less impact.
Right. Well, of course, if you do raise that mower and you don't kill all the clover that's in your property, you do get blooming clover, and it does support the generalist bees, particularly honeybees and some of the native bees. What I promote is to again have less lawn that you need to mow, but mow it and keep it pristine, keep it manicured. You don't have to put anything on it, but the more you mow it, the nicer it looks. And that's the cue for care. That all of a sudden you're accepted in your neighborhood, and then the area you take out of lawn, you're gonna have essentially no mowing. That's going to be your pollinator gardens. That's where you're going to put in the layered landscape. So reducing the area that we have to mow, because areas that you mow, if you raise the blade, it's not useless, but it's not nearly as good as if you are actually taking it out of mowing and putting it in more useful plants. But the lawn you keep right along your driveway, right along your sidewalk, or bordering your beds, that's what makes that landscape look neat and acceptable to your HOA, to your neighbors. People are worried about native plant landscaping reducing property values. So let's landscape in a way that does not reduce property values. As a matter of fact, there was a really interesting article in the real estate section of last Saturday's New York Times, I think it was, talking about, and it was to the real estate people, about these native landscaping that are enhancing the property value. People are looking for it now. So done tastefully, it's enhancing your property value, and that's going to make a big difference. I was really excited to see that.
Yeah, I mean, out here we have a lot of dry, what you might consider non-irrigated pasture, or areas that are not lawn and not irrigated. They're going to dry out, and a lot of times it's tall grass if you don't mow it. We're tempted to mow it right down tight because we feel like that's the best in terms of fire protection. We've
Yeah,
also found that some, leaving it long as possible and things like that can also help promote some native plants to have a chance to, flower and go to seed within the sea of these invasive grasses. And
right.
mowing high, as high as we can be comfortable with seems to, also prevent some of the invasive weeds like puncture vine and stuff that love those sunny open areas.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Life is full of compromises, and these are best practices in particular areas that you know a lot more about than I do. So to say no mowing or yes mowing, it's all gray area, and you want to pick what's best for your particular ecoregion.
All right. Well, we got 2 minutes left. I'm going to fit one more in here.
Okay.
Elisa also asked, I've heard that some European plants like lavender and thyme can act as decoys for the honeybees, freeing up some of the native plants for native pollinators. Any truth in that statement from your perspective?
Yeah, there probably is. You've got your honeybee hive, which has 30,000 members in it, and it's going to go out there and forage as much as possible, but they will go to the areas that are providing the most, particularly nectar. Um, and lavender is a good one. It'll do that. So if you're going to have honeybees and you increase the amount of resources for bees in your landscape, it will reduce the competition with the native bees. A third of our native bee species are specialists, and they're going to go to the plants they're specializing on. And if you can divert the honeybees away from those plants, yes, that's a good thing.
Great. Well, thank you. I think that's something that I know I've certainly worked with that in my yard. Many of us have a mix, like you mentioned before, of plants, and so it's good to know that it's actually playing some positive role there.
Yeah.
Hey,
But
Doug,
but
there's
you know,
just
look at the flowering plants in your on your property, and if it's 99% honeybees, you've got an issue. You want to have those native bees out. So, all right,
there's
that's all
so
I'll say.
there's just so much good feedback here. I mean, there's just really kind of an endless stream of folks saying, "Hey, thank you for the inspiration. This is, gotten them started, gotten them going, helped
Good.
them teach others." So we just really appreciate you and the good work you do. Thanks for joining us tonight and delivering your message here in person with us on Zoom. It's just been great to interact with you. And I think everybody, nearly everyone on the call has chimed in to say the same thing. And there's a lot of hearts floating up. You probably see that too. So
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and good luck to everybody.
thank you.
Okay, all right, take
With
care.
that, I'm going to go ahead and end the call. Thanks to everybody who was here tonight. And we'll look forward to seeing you for Mike Amaranthus in July. Take care.